Hello, and welcome to Hoosier Property Taxes, the Local Impact. My name is Emily Gorman, and I am the Director of Community Engagement for AARP Indiana. Before we jump into the program today, AARP Indiana wants to acknowledge the recent severe weather events that have impacted Lake County. We know that many residents are focused on responding to the damage, supporting loved ones and neighbors, and beginning the recovery process. Many are still without power, and our thoughts are with everyone who's been affected. This program is being recorded today and will be sent to registrants by email following the event, and anyone unable to join us live can watch this recording at a later time that works better for you. This recording is also going to be available on AARP Indiana's website and our YouTube channel. For those of you joining us today, thank you so much for being here, and hopefully you'll find this conversation helpful. We are hosting this event today because property taxes are critical to the well-being of our communities, but older Hoosiers can't always afford them. This is especially true when they are experiencing property tax increases on top of other rising monthly expenses like utilities, groceries, and healthcare. During 2025 state legislative session, AARP Indiana was fighting for legislation to keep property taxes affordable at the State House. As a part of our commitment to keep Hoosiers 50 plus informed and prepared, we want to take time today to walk you through some of the impacts and changes that you can expect to see as a result of Senate Enrolled Act 1 from last year's legislative session. While this topic is often feels very complex and complicated, we hope that you'll find today's event informative and useful as you plan ahead for these changes and how they will impact you on a local level. So to kick things off this afternoon, I want to introduce Christine Sid, Lake County Council President. Christine has been serving as a Lake County Councilwoman for District 5 since 2004, and she currently serves as President of the Council. She's the Chair of Public Safety Budget Committees and the Legislative Committee. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, Councilor, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights. I'm going to hand over to you to take it away.
Thank you, Emily. And especially thank you for addressing your concerns for this residents of Lake County who have been going through a difficult time because of the storm. Although we will survive, and we have been standing together as a community. Thank you again. I've been serving the 5th District of Lake County, representing East Chicago, Hammond, and Whiting. It's the northern part of the county, low to moderate incomes, and highly industrial. I understand the financial pressures that inflation and rising costs place on families, especially seniors. I am a senior, and others living on fixed incomes. Inflation has also affected county budgets. Property taxes are a legitimate concern, and we must pursue meaningful relief for homeowners. At the same time, Lake County's property tax challenges are not the result of excessive local spending. The County Council has been a responsible steward of taxpayers' dollars, developing budgets within the growth quotient established by the Indiana Department of Local Government Finance. Senate Bill 1 creates additional financial uncertainty for local governments. In response, the Lake County Council took a fiscally responsible step by returning the 2026 county budgets to 2025 spending levels. We will continue to demand efficiency and accountability while ensuring that essential services, especially public safety, paving roads, and health services, remain adequately funded. After all, that is what I was hired to do. Lake County stands to lose $50 million by 2031 under the current legislation. We also need to address the underlying factors of affecting Lake County taxpayers. The COVID-19 housing sales increased homes assessed values. the assessment and taxation of commercial and industrial properties, including major industrial facilities, deserve careful attention. Currently, the state assesses the industry, not our assessor. Changes to personal property taxation have also shifted more of the tax burden towards homeowners. These issues are part of any serious discussion of property tax reform. We must consider the legislation as a whole, including changes to existing tax caps, property tax relief credits, and deductions. We need to understand how these changes will affect homeowners and renters, particularly seniors and families with limited incomes. Ultimately, reducing property taxes is only meaningful if the cost is not simply shifted to another form of taxation. If property tax revenue is replaced by higher income taxes, sales taxes, or other revenues, we must ask who will bear that burden. Lake County residents deserve sustainable property tax relief that protects homeowners while preserving the essential services that keep our community safe and strong. I look forward to continuing that conversation with state officials and working toward solutions that provide real relief without creating unintended financial burdens for taxpayers or local governments. Thank you for allowing me to share the perspective of Lake County and the residents we present. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Councilwoman, and we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon and for your leadership in Lake County. So now we're going to move on to the meat and potatoes of today's program. What changes can you expect to see from your property taxes going forward? And to that end, we have a wonderful lineup of guests and experts for the remainder of today's program to break this down for you in a way that really makes sense. Our first guest is Larry DeBoer. Larry is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. He retired in 2021 after 37 years at Purdue. He is an expert in state and local public policy, particularly in issues related to Indiana property taxation. Thank you so much for being here today, Larry, and please take it away.
Hi, I'm Larry DeBoer, Emeritus Professor of Agricultural Economics. Emeritus means has been or retired. And I'm very pleased to be with you here today to speak about the property tax reform that is ongoing in Indiana. We had some very interesting things happening to the property tax after the pandemic, and the legislature responded in 2025 with a great big property tax reform. I think the third major property tax reform since 1973. And so it's going to phase in over the next 5 years out to 2031. So I think it behooves us to take a look at what we can expect, what is scheduled to happen, what impact that might have on local governments, and what impact it might have on homeowners that I know many of you are. So let's take a look now at Indiana property tax reform and see what's likely to happen. First of all, the pandemic and the property tax. Hey, why do we need property tax reform? Well, the pandemic came along and really caused some big changes. And the root of that change was what happened to property values. And we've got good measures of home prices in Indiana. This is the average transactions price of a home in Indiana, and it's the percentage change from year to year. And you see in the double O's in the 2000s, the increase was between about 2.5% and 5% per year. And that's been true in Indiana for a long, long time, going back into the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. And that's the kind of increase we were used to. Then came the Great Recession in 2007, 8, 9, and home values actually declined for a while, and that was unusual. But after that, they increased at an increasing rate. They accelerated until by the end of the 20-teens, we were seeing increases above 5% per year. Very unusual, unusually high for Indiana. Then came the pandemic, and you see for a couple of years there, we had double-digit increases in home values. And even since then, in 25, 24, and 23, we've seen increases above 5%, extraordinary increases in home values. In fact, over that period of time, since 2020, home values on average are 57% higher than they were back in 2020. So if you've been following the home prices in your neighborhood or the selling prices on real estate sites, and you're wondering, when did I move to California? Well, that's what it looks like, isn't it? Prices that we were not used to are what we're seeing in Indiana right now. Well, you know, the property tax is a tax on the value of property, and the value of your property was going up. And so sure enough, the net assessed value of property as valued by the assessors for the property tax, that went up too. Now you see some pretty big bars off to the left there in 2007 and 2009, and that had to do with the Daniels reform, and that's what we were talking about 20 years ago. But starting in the Great Recession, you see that home values actually declined in 1 year and increased very little after that. But then home values began to accelerate. The increases in assessed value, and this is not just home values, but all values of property, increased at more than 5% in 2022. And then the pandemic came, and we saw an increase of almost 50% in 2023, and then extraordinarily large increases in the years after that. One thing that tells you is that our assessing system works. Indiana's assessment standard is called market value in use, which means what the assessors aim to do is to value your home and all other property based on what they think it would sell for if it went out into the market in a free and fair sale for the same use to which it's put now. Right? So market value in use is what we say. And so you would expect if the assessment system was working and actual market values went up, that assessed values should go up too, and they did. So our assessment system is working. Now, one thing to know is that there's a 2-year lag between what happens in the economy, what happens to actual selling prices, and what happens to your property taxes. And that's because, well, for example, home values went way up in 2021. Assessors looked back in 2022 for the only data they had, which was data from the past. And so in 2022, the assessed values reflected what happened in 2021 with market values. And then those values in 2022 were the basis of property tax billing in 2023. So the 2021 shock to home values due to the pandemic showed up in your property tax bills in 2023. And that affected your tax bills too, right? And what we see here are the net levy after credits. And so this is both the revenue collected by local governments and the tax bills that people have paid. And you can see the pattern looks pretty much the same as it did with assessed value, and look pretty much the same as it did with home values. We see increasing rate of increase throughout the 20-teens, and then great big increases in the levy in 23, 24, and 25. And the tax levy, that's what we call revenue, the revenue that's actually collected from the property tax. The property tax levy that local governments can set is rather stringently controlled by the state. There is a maximum levy, and the increase each year is controlled by the maximum levy growth quotient. But not the whole levy. The whole levy is not under that maximum. And in particular, debt service and school referendum rates are outside of that maximum. And those were the levies that went way up as a result of the rise in net assessed value. So the increase in assessed value, yes, did cause an increase in taxes and an increase in the revenues that local governments collected. Well, it was at that point that the legislature looked and said, hey, we got to do something about this. And we got the tax reform of 2025. Now, the tax reform it passed in 2025 was in Senate Enrolled Act 1. And that's why we call it SEA 1. And it phases in, as you see, from 2026 to 2031. SEA1 provisions that kick in this year include the supplemental homestead credit. Now, this is the tax cut you're going to feel this year, right? And it's a 10% cut in your tax bill up to $300. So you calculate the whole tax bill, or the treasurer calculates the whole tax bill, and then they knock 10% off up to $300. So that's a credit that is going to start in 2026 and continue on into the future. We're going to eliminate the 30% floor on new business equipment assessments. Now, that homeowners don't have to be concerned with that, but the 30% floor limits the amount of depreciation that firms can take on their business equipment for property tax purposes. And at the moment, there's a floor of 30%. They can't depreciate more than to 30% of the value of their property. We're going to remove that from here on in. And so by about the year 2030, businesses may begin to see lower taxes as a result of this. We're going to use a 9% capitalization rate on farmland assessments. We assess farmland based on a capitalization formula where you take a measure of farm income and divide it by an interest rate. The interest rate we've been using is 8%, but now we're going to use 9% for a while. And if you increase the denominator of a quotient like that, the value goes down, and that should reduce the value of farmland by about 11%, actually. And then we've changed the calendar on school referendums. Up till now, school referendums where you propose a property tax increase and the voters within the school corporation get to vote on whether to approve it or not. In the past, we've been able to do school referendums in any year, and in the May primary election or in the November general election. From now on, it's only going to take place in November of even-numbered years. So that's November of general elections. That's 2026 is one of those years. And so we're not only going to see the normal number of referendums in November, we're going to see the ones that would have taken place in May, and we'll see the ones that would have taken place in May and November of next year. And so I've heard consultants say there could be 50 or even 100 school referendums on the ballots across the state this November. The maximum we've ever had before is 18, I think. So that's going to be quite a sampling of school referendums. On into the future, next year, we're going to create a $2 million personal property exemption, which means that any firm whose property cost less than $2 million to buy, that is the equipment property, not the land and buildings, just the equipment. If it costs less than $2 million, they don't have to pay property taxes on it. If it costs more than $2 million, then you do have to pay property taxes on it. So that kicks in 2027. In 2029, we're going to completely reform the local income tax system, and that will have a little bit of an effect on property taxes, as I'll show you here in a little bit. By 2031, it will be fully phased in. Now, I think the most important thing that happens as a result of SEA1, especially for homeowners, is the deductions. And there's three deductions we need to talk about. First of all, the standard deduction. Standard deduction is a fixed $48,000 that is subtracted from the assessed value of the home. So the assessor sets the assessed value, and you subtract $48,000 before you apply the tax rates. Second, as you can see, that one's going to phase out. That's going to be reduced to zero by 2031. So that deduction is going away. The supplemental deduction is 37.5% in 2025 and 40% this year. It's going to go up to 66.7%, or 2/3. And that's a percentage that is subtracted from the value of your, the assessed value of your home after the standard deduction is applied. So both of those things reduce the taxable value of your home. Finally, we're going to introduce an entirely new deduction for rental housing and second homes and farmland. And they've never had a big deduction before, but that's going to phase in. It's going to be 6% this year in 2026, and by 2031, it'll be 33.4%. So that one is phasing in. So one of the main things that SEA1 does is to increase the deductions on most homeowners and on rental housing and on farmland. So a rather large chunk of the tax base of the property tax is going to see increased deductions, which means less of the value of that property will actually be taxable. Well, let's take a look at what might happen with assessed value and the tax rates. And before we do that, though, let's think of two different ways of looking at tax policy. Right? There's the way that the legislature does it, and it's absolutely appropriate for the legislature to do it this way, and that's to compare the results of their policy to a forecast or estimate of what would have happened had the policy not been changed. Right? So what you're doing is saying, hey, here's what the world would have looked like had we not changed the policy. Here's what the world actually looks like. The difference between the two is what the policy did. Apart from anything else that might have happened anyway, here's what the policy did. And that works as a way to look at the impact of policy. But people, you and me, we don't think that way. Right? We don't compare our tax bill to some alternate universe where a different policy would have been used to determine that tax bill. No, we compare our tax bill this year to what our tax bill was last year. Right? So there's two ways to look at it. You're looking at a comparison of the policy to what would have been, or a comparison of the policy to what was. Let me tell you, it's perfectly possible for something to look like a tax cut when compared to what would have been, and a tax increase when you compare it to what was. So it's important to keep those two straight. And I'll be telling you as we go which point of view I'm using. All right. Now let's take a look at some data. And here's a table of data. Indiana assessments in 2025 if SEA 1 had fully phased in. So what I'm going to do is take the actual data from 2025 and I'm going to ask the question, what would the world have looked like if SEA 1 had been fully in effect in 2025? What would assessed values have looked like? What would the levy have looked like? What would tax rates have looked like? And I'm going to apply it to the 5 categories of property that we usually use here in Indiana. And the first one, as you can see, is homesteads. Now, homesteads have those 2 deductions, the standard deduction and the supplemental deduction. There are a few smaller ones as well. And those 2 together reduce gross assessed value, the value that the assessor puts on your property, to net assessed value, the value that's actually taxed, by about 50%. Cuts it in half. We only tax half of the value of homes in Indiana as of 2025. But we're going to now apply a 2/3 deduction, right? 66.7% is going to be the supplemental deduction by 2031. And if we had applied that, you can see that net assessed value would have been about 34% lower than it actually was in 2025. So homestead net assessed values are going to be down substantially, or would have been down substantially from what they were actually in 2025. What about non-homestead residential and farmland? They're grouped together under that 33.4% deduction. As you can see, in 2025, 95% of rental housing, non-homestead residential, was actually taxed, and 99.7% of farmland was actually taxed. Farmland got hardly anything in deductions. Now they're going to get 33.4%. So this is brand new, and I suspect they're very excited about this. It's going to phase in by 2031, and of course, being a 1/3 deduction, is going to reduce the assessed value, or would have reduced the assessed value that is taxable in 2025 by about 1/3. How about business real property? Well, business real property got nothing from SEA 1. As you can see, about 77% of business real property, and this is land and buildings of businesses, about 77% was actually taxed, and the difference are the abatements that we give them to improve, to enhance economic development. That's going to remain the same. They didn't get an additional deduction on their land and buildings, but business personal got that new $2 million exemption. That is, the firms that have less than $2 million in equipment cost, the cost to acquire the equipment, that they won't have to pay. And some estimates have said that about 90% of all businesses won't have to pay personal property taxes anymore. The thing is, though, most of the personal property is owned by really big businesses, right? It's not your hairdressers and your travel agents that own all the personal property, the computers and the hair dryers and the chairs. No, that's not a lot of personal property. That's less than $2 billion. They won't have to pay on that. Where the personal property is with the big manufacturers and the steel firms and the utilities who have way more than $2 million. And what that means is that even though 90% of all the taxpayers may be exempt, we'll probably only lose a maximum of about 28% off of net assessed value. Now, we can't get the number exactly because the acquisition cost of business equipment, which is what the exemption is about, that's private information and it's not released to the public. We can estimate from assessments, but we don't have the actual data. So the 28%, that's the maximum amount that we're likely to lose from the personal property tax base. Add it up, and what do we get? 26.9%. That is, the tax base, had SEA 1 been fully applied in 2025, the tax base would have been 27% lower than it actually was. Now, what does that mean over time? What does that mean over time? Because after all, gross assessed value is going to continue to increase. There's going to be new construction. There's going to be land changed from lesser uses to more expensive uses. Population is going to increase. And of course, property values are going to rise as well. So all of those things are going to increase gross assessed value. But with a 27% decrease, as you see in this table, what it means is that gross assessed values are going to have to grow by about 3.5% to 4% per year just to keep net assessed value constant. That is, if it grows more slowly than that, net assessed value is actually going to fall from 2025 to 2031. All right, so keep that in mind from what we're about to say next, which is the levy. The levy is the revenue that's collected from the property tax that local governments raise to deliver their services. But the property tax is different from all the other taxes in that we recalculate the tax rate every year. And there's a different tax rate for every unit of government. And across the state, there's more than 2,000 different property tax rates, depending on where you live and at which governments actually serve your service needs. Back in 2025, we raised $12.5 billion. All these numbers here are in millions. $12.5 billion in the levy. And so to calculate the tax rate, what we did was to take the levy and divide it by net assessed value, $524 billion, and express it as dollars per $100 assessed value. So you read that average tax rate there as $2.38 and change per $100 assessed value. Now, if you want to think of it as a percentage, that's fine. You can do that. It's the same thing as a percentage. But if you want to talk to a local official or a legislator or something like that, you want to use the terminology we use, which is $2.38. So that's the tax rate. Now, what happens? Well, now the net assessed value is going to be lower, but we're still going to try to raise the same amount of levy. That's what would have happened had we applied SEA 1 in 2025. The tax rate would have been $3.25, almost $3.26, or the tax rate going up 36.7%. Now, over time, what's going to happen? Well, over time, the levy is going to rise 3, 4, 5% a year, as it always does, to handle inflation and population growth. But assessed value is not going to rise. Net assessed value is not going to change very much because of all the new deductions all the way out to 2031. And so the tax rate is going to go up year after year after year. And as you can see, 36.7% is where we'd end up had we applied it in 2025. Now, $3 turns out to be important under the new system. Gross, let's suppose, and let me show you why, by taking a homestead worth $300,000. And I'm taking that because it makes the arithmetic easy. We have in our Constitution something called the circuit breaker. It's a cap on your property taxes. The cap equals 1% of the gross assessed value, that is the assessor's estimate of what your property is worth. So 1% of $300,000 would be $3,000. You can't pay more than that on a house valued at $300,000. Now, the school referendum rates are outside of this system, so you pay extra for that. But for everything else, the cap is $3,000. Now, if we have a deduction of 66.7%, the deduction amount will be just over $200,000, And the net AV after subtracting that deduction would be just under 100,000. Now, what kind of rate would produce a tax of $3,000 on a net AV of $100,000? Well, it's a $3 rate, a little bit more than $3. So if the rate goes above $3, the tax bill would go up over $3,000, but you can't pay more than $3,000 because of the circuit breaker. The property tax on homeowners is maxed out when the rate goes above $3. If you do that same calculation for residential and farmland, they've got a circuit breaker rate of 2%, but they've got a deduction of 1/3. Arithmetic works out the same. $3 rate. You get a rate above $3, and no more property taxes can be raised from landlords, non-residential rental property, or I should say non-homestead rental property, and farmland. Likewise with business, they have no new deduction, but their cap rate is 3%. You go above $3, they don't pay any more property taxes. Now, what did we just say might happen to the tax rate? We just said it might go above $3. This is one of the concerns that local governments have. If a lot of rates go up above $3, you've maxed out the property tax. And will that decrease the amount of revenue that they receive? Could very well be. Now, an awful lot of local governments have hired consultants to try to project forward to see what impact this is going to have. So they're worried about that. They're worried about the supplemental homestead credit, that 10% reduction in your tax bill, which is unfunded. That is, nobody's replacing that revenue. It just goes away. It's part of your tax bill that you're not going to pay. So they're going to lose that revenue. And then think about the schools that have the referendum rates. The referendum rates are fixed. They expected to apply that referendum rate to an ever-increasing net assessed value, which will not happen now. So the referendums are going to raise less revenue than they thought. So all of those things have got local governments concerned about how they're going to deliver services with this new property tax system. Well, let's take a look at your tax bill. Right? Let's take a look at homeowner taxes. And, the information I'm going to show you here, you've got it for your own home. Because every spring, along about the time that tax bills go out, the county treasurer, sends you a TS1 form, which is an 8.5 by 11 page. You've probably looked at it and said, what is this? It's just chock full of numbers. What it is an explanation of how we go from the gross assessed value of your house, that is the value of your house, all the way down to your tax bill. We can use that information to compare what happened to your taxes, or what happened to the typical tax bill in 2025, what would have happened under the old system by 2031, and what just might happen under SEA1. So let's take a look at what the tax bill looked like in 2025. And I started with the gross assessed value, that is the value of the home, the selling price of the home, of $234,500, which is the average gross assessed value of a home in Indiana in 2025. We subtract off the $48,000 standard deduction, and that gives us $186,500. We subtract off 37.5% of that $186,000, and that's $69,938. And we subtract both those deductions from the gross assessed value, we get a net assessed value, or taxable assessed value, of $116,563. Just about half of the gross assessed value. And we saw that in the actual data, where net assessed value was about 50% of gross assessed value statewide. Then we apply the district tax rate. I've used the average tax rate here at $238. That gives you a gross tax bill of $2,779. But you don't pay that. At least in 59 counties, you've got a LIT credit, and LIT is local income tax. And in those 59 counties, they've got a tax rate, an income tax rate, which raises money, which they then use to buy down the property tax for homeowners and other taxpayers sometimes. And the average credit for those 59 counties is 16%. So that revenue does get replaced, right? The $445, which is 16% of $2,779, that $445 is revenue that you don't pay on your property tax, but gets replaced for local governments from the income tax that is raised. But that leaves your tax bill at $2334. Now we're going to compare it to the tax cap. The tax cap is 1% of 234,500, which is 2345. And as it happens for the average taxpayer, it is just under the cap by $11. So you pay the $22,334, and that is your final tax bill. Now, what would happen if we kept that system and moved forward to 2031? Well, what happens between now and then? Well, recent experience tells us that the value of homes are going to keep going up. The gross assessed value is going to rise. I picked a 5% annual increase. Will it be 5%? Well, that's kind of what it was for the few years right before COVID. So maybe, right? But we need a number, so we'll take 5%. It's at least plausible. We subtract the 48, we subtract the supplemental, and we end up with a taxable net assessed value of 166,408. Notice that's a little more than half of the 314. The reason why it's more than half is that the homestead standard didn't increase, right? It's now a smaller percentage of the value of the home. Use the same district tax rate of 238. Tax rates have been relatively stable over the last several years. It's assessed value that's going up, not the tax rates. That's why your tax bill has risen. So we'll use the same district tax rate. It's easy to do. And we'll see that the gross tax bill is $39.67. Lit credit of 16%, subtract 635, and that gives you a really beautiful number, 3,333. We compare that to the tax cap, and we find, oh boy, 1% of 314 up top is $3,143. The tax bill after lit credits is higher than your tax cap, and so you get a tax cap credit of $190. That is revenue that you do not have to, that is tax bill you do not have to pay, and revenue that the local governments do not receive. So that's a revenue loss for local governments. That brings the tax bill down to $31.43. Now, what's actually going to happen, right? That's what would have happened had the old system remained in effect. What's going to happen with SEA 1? Well, nothing different happens to gross assessed value. It just increases 5%. Homestead standard deduction goes away, disappears. It's down to 0. But the supplemental deduction percent goes up to 66.7. The supplemental deduction gets very large, and the net assessed value is $104,646. That's about $62,000 lower than it would have been in 2031, but it's also lower than it was in 2025. Right? It's lower by about $12,000. So think about this from local government's point of view. This big piece of their tax base, homes, going to be declining in value over the next 5 years. So the tax base is going to be shrinking for local governments. What's going to happen to the tax rate? Well, it's going to go up. We said about 37% from the other simulation, so let's use that. That puts it up to $3.12, above $3. A gross tax bill of $3,268. One of the things the local income tax reform is going to do is to eliminate the lit credits. As of 2029, lit credits are gone. So we don't have that. We look at 1% of 314, we get 3143. That is higher than the tax bill after lit credits by $126. So you get a tax cap credit of that amount. That brings your tax bill down to $3143. That's the same as it was in 2031, but now we've got the supplemental homestead credit rate of 10% up to $300, and 10% of $3114 is $314. So you get a $300 reduction. That's $2843. All right. Is this a tax cut or is it not? Compared to what would have been, it's a tax cut of $300. Compared to what was, the tax bill is $509 higher. Right? It's lower than $3143 by $300. It's higher than $2334 by $509. So is this a tax cut or is it not? Yes, it's a tax cut. Actually, compared to what would have happened, yes, it's a tax cut. But what it means is that your taxes are going to go up more slowly than they would have. Now, they might go down in 2026, or you know by now whether they have gone down in 2026. I think a majority of homeowners, maybe a bare majority, but a majority of homeowners will see lower taxes in 2026 than they saw in 2025 because of the supplemental homestead credit rate, which kicks in all at once in 2026. After that, though, we're likely to see continued increases because of rising gross assessed values and the rising district tax rate. That's for the average homeowner, and I think for most homeowners will look like that. But what about lower valued homes in rural areas? Let's have a home that starts out at $80,000 in 2025. And I can hear you folks in urban areas and suburban areas saying, $80,000, where are their homes valued at $80,000? I'll tell you where. In rural Indiana, that's where. In Jay County, for example, which is a rural county, Portland, Indiana is the county seat. It's northeast of Muncie on the Ohio border. In Jay County, about a third of all the homes are valued at $80,000 or less. So this is important in rural Indiana. And if we're talking about taxes outside of cities and towns, we're talking about low tax rates like a $2 rate here. Look what has happened to gross assessed value to net assessed value. Under the old system, net assessed value was reduced by 3/4 because $48,000 is a big part of $80,000, a 3/4 reduction. But what happens in 2031? It's only a 2/3 reduction. And so the assessed value is $35,700, way bigger than it was in 2025. Remember, for the average homeowner, the net assessed value was actually lower in 2031 than it was in 2025. For the lower valued homes, it's higher. When we come down to the net tax bill after making all the other changes, all the other calculations, what do we see? We see a tax bill of $842, which is higher than it was and higher than it would have been. So for lower value homes, this is not a tax cut under any definition. Well, that's an idea about what happens to the homeowners. And you've seen I've clicked through a couple of extra slides. If you take a look at the AARP Indiana website, you can find everything I clicked through, which has summaries of everything I've said. Each slide has a description on it of what I said about that slide. Let me give a little plug for some papers I have written for the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute, indianafiscal.org. Under news and publications, you can find them. In 2024, I wrote a history of property tax policy over the last 50 years and an explanation of what COVID did to our property tax. And then just last year, last fall, put out a paper about this property tax reform here in 2025. If you're really interested in this sort of thing, there is a lot more information there than I can talk to you about in the time we've had together here. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you to AARP Indiana for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about Indiana property tax reform. I'm Larry DeBoer from Agricultural Economics, retired, Purdue University. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Larry. It is incredibly helpful to have a better understanding of how we got to this point, and there's nobody better to explain it than you. And our next guests, Jamie Bolster and Campbell Ricci, will be able to build on our understanding even further. Campbell serves as the Policy and Financial Resources Director for Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, or AIM, where he serves on the legislative team and provides technical assistance to the membership. He joined AIM in the fall of 2019, and prior to working there, Campbell worked at the Indiana Senate as Deputy Policy Director. Jamie Bolster serves as the Director of Government Affairs with the Association of Indiana Counties, or AIC. She has more than 25 years of diverse local government experience, both in elected and appointed leadership roles, including overseeing the budgets of all Indiana's local government units while serving as budget director, and later as deputy commissioner and chief of staff at the Indiana Department of Local Government Finance. So thank you so much for joining us, Jamie and Campbell. I am going to hand things over to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for certainly having both Campbell and I. And I think here in a second, you'll have there it is, our slide deck, where we are going to unpack some of this recent legislative change. We understand that there was a deep dive that Larry DeBoer just provided. So as we move through this, we'll try to be understanding to the areas that he has previously already covered. So with that, we are going to take a look at today on the agenda, the property tax reform, and then I'm going to hand it over to Campbell, and he's going to do the local income tax reform that we've seen not only in the 2025 session, but then there were some further changes this last session in 2026. So with that said, we're going to jump right in to Senate Enrolled Act 1 in 2025. It does phase out some of the homestead standard deductions. As Larry mentioned, prior to this legislative change, that standard deduction was a flat amount of $48,000. So for this year, the taxes that you have paid the spring installment already, that flat amount is still there at $48,000. That's going to begin to phase down until it phases out completely. For the 2030 taxes due and payable in 2031, where it phases out completely. Some of the reason behind this flat amount is it exposed some complexities or issues that were within the property tax and assessment system. With it being a flat amount, it didn't keep up with some of the increases year over year that some of our taxpayers throughout the state saw. So with that said, this next slide will show you the phase in. So as that flat deduction phases out, this will show you the phase in of the homestead supplemental deduction. It is a percentage based, which will keep up with the changes of assessed value now. So beginning with pay 26, that percentage grew from last year being 37.5% to this year being 40%. That will increase again another 6%. So as it'll proportionally grow that deduction as the assessed value changes year over year. And once it's fully implemented, homestead property owners will have 2/3 of their overall gross assessed value that is deducted. So they'll only be responsible for paying 1/3 of what's considered that homestead property. Moving to the next slide is a new deduction that was created and will be phased in over time. This 2% circuit breaker deduction is eligible for properties that are assessed as 2%. That would be your agricultural land, your residential properties that do not have a homestead, such as a income-driven residential property. Apartment buildings are also within that classification. So this deduction is going to phase in. This first year is the first year it was eligible at 6%. This next year it'll be 12%. And upon final completion of the phase-in, it'll go up to 1/3 of the overall assessments in that 2% circuit breaker category. Moving on, Senate Enrolled Act 1 of the 2025 session and House Enrolled Act 1210 from the 2026 session converted deductions to credits and also created new credits. So beginning with property taxes that are due currently, the over 65 credit was enacted at $150. That was previously a $14,000 deduction off of the assessed value. So with the deduction, it just reduces that gross assessed value that's eligible to be taxable, where the $150 credit is a dollar for dollar credit off of your total tax liability. The blind disabled credit was created in the amount of $125. And that was previously a deduction of $12,480. The supplemental homestead is the new deduction the new credit that was also created. And it is a 10% deduction not to exceed, 10% credit not to exceed $300 for homestead eligible property. So for homesteaders, they're going to get that phase out of the homestead flat deduction, and then the phase in of that homestead supplemental deduction. And then they'll also now be eligible to receive that not to exceed $300 credit. A deduction is different than a credit. Again, the deduction is applied to the assessed value. That has an effect to shift the overall tax liability as it's applied. However, a credit is a dollar for dollar savings to that homeowner, which is a proportionate loss for each of those governmental units then. Beginning with property tax due and payable in 2027, the disabled veterans deduction is being applied. So first, veterans that are 100% disabled will receive 100% deduction off of that assessed value. Again, as a deduction, it will shift that tax liability. Then they also created 2 credits of $250, which was a previous deduction of $14,000, and then also the $350 credit, which was previously a $24,960 deduction. Again, those are eligible for our veterans. Moving on, the over 65 credits for the $150, when that was implemented, it also changed some of the eligibility requirements. So a lot more people are now eligible than what were historically. So the over 60, you have to be over 65 or 65 or over on or before December 31st of the year prior to the taxes first being due and payable. So you'll want to check your information on your tax statement. It's also referenced as a TS1 form. Every taxpayer receives that with their property tax bill. You will want to check that to see if you currently have that deduction or that credit on your tax statement. You can also call your local county auditor's office. Income limits raised for single filers from $30,000 to $60,000, and then for joint filers from $40,000 to $70,000. So again, a lot more taxpayers will be eligible for that now. Also, the assessed value that was previously in place that would cap the eligibility at assessed values not to exceed $240,000, that provision was also removed. If you're eligible to receive that over 65 credit now, you will also be eligible for the over 65 circuit breaker credit. That is a protection that's very important for our taxpayers that are over the age of 65. What it does is it protects that year-over-year liability not to exceed 2%. So if your taxes would have otherwise went up 5%, you're capped and you will not pay more than a 2% year-over-year liability on your property taxes. Moving to the next slide, this slide simply shows the order of operations to calculate a property tax bill. Beginning at line 4, where it says property tax caps, at line 4 and after, those are direct credits, dollar for dollar credits to the taxpayer, and they're a direct loss of revenue to the local units of government. Moving on to the next slide, you can kind of see this in play now. So taking that order of operations and putting it in place to show you how a tax bill is impacted. If you recall, Larry DeBoer just showed you a similar comparison, but he showed you the impact from 25 to 2031 when the bill was fully implemented. What I'm going to show you here is just the year over year from 25 under the old system to 26 under the new system as these deductions begin to phase in and the new credits. So you can see in the first column where it says 24 pay 25, the gross assessed value used is $230,000. You can then see the standard homestead deduction of $48,000 applied. That supplemental homestead deduction, which again, remember, was 37.5% for 24 pay 25. And then that over 65 deduction, which was $14,000. So the net assessed value in 24 pay 25 under this example was $99,750. The tax rate we're using here is $2.45 per 100 assessed value. That gives us a gross tax liability of $2,443.88. Then moving down, you can see that this property is eligible to receive a property tax cap credit. And that's simply applied. If you look at the chart on the right side of your screen where it says circuit breaker cap, you can see the 1% amount that it's capped at. So the 230 cannot exceed $2,300. You're simply just taking 1% times that gross AV. And I apologize, where it says 2 and 3, those are still 1% because this is all 1% property. So you can see that since that gross tax liability exceeded that cap of $2,300, that's the difference there is what's applied as that property tax cap credit. That then provides you with an overall net liability of $2,300. Well, if you look there at the bottom line, again, if the over 65 circuit breaker credit would apply in this column, because last year for 23 pay 24, the overall tax liability for this taxpayer was $2,200. Well, since that cannot exceed 2% growth year over year, this example, they're going to get a $56 over 65 circuit breaker cap to reduce the overall liability for 24 pay 25 to $2,244. Now, if you look at the next column to the right, that's the first example with the new changes implemented. The only difference between that column in example 1 and the far right column of example 2 is just showing some growth in assessed value. The example 1 is keeping the gross assessed value consistent at that $230,000. So you can see an identical comparison and also that same tax rate, where the savings, if all other things remain consistent, the savings would have been $309 from 24 pay 25 to that example 1. Then in that example 2, what we did show was a 6% growth in gross assessed value to $243,800. And then we also showed a 4% increase in that tax rate from $2.45 to $2.55 to just show some practical growth in both of those rates and values. That year-over-year savings by converting some of these deductions and phasing them in and phasing them out, as well as applying those new credits, would save still $184.80. Moving to the next slide, some additional information that occurred dated back well before Senate Enrolled Act 1. Actually, House Enrolled Act 1499 from the 23 session put a cap or a limit, a maximum not to exceed, on the growth of the property tax levy. Again, the property tax levy is just how much in revenue those local units anticipate to collect. So the MLGQ is just a fancy way of saying the maximum levy growth quotient. It could not exceed 4% for pay 24, pay 25, and pay 26. So there was just a capacity or a rate cap that those levies or that property tax revenue could not generate more than for each of those local units of government. And you can also see in pay 24 that saved 1% of growth, of revenue growth. For pay 26, it would have been a 6% factor growth. However, with that being capped, there was 2% that was left off of those collections for the local units. Next year, that was not extended. So that provision was sunset. And in pay 27, you'll see some of those property tax levies begin to increase again because that went up another 2% to that 1.06. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean, and how does it affect that ultimate tax rate that we all have, that we're all paying our property taxes on? Well, the higher the growth in overall net assessed value, it should lower that tax rate. Lower levies, like you've seen these last couple years, would also indicate a lower tax rate. But if you're going to have a levy increase, say of 6%, like you'll see in pay 27, that outpaces that collective total certified net assessed value, or simply put, the tax base for property taxes, you're going to see an overall higher rate. Moving on is just a couple more examples of what has happened year over year. So debt issuance is a common reason why tax rates could grow even if the total assessed values outpace the levies. So say you have more assessed value growth than what those levies grew, you can still see tax rate growth due to debt issuance. As you can see from this slide, schools account for 88.58% of all debt issued statewide using property taxes as the backing to pay those bonds. Cities and towns account for 4.76% and counties at 2.38%. Looking at a year-over-year comparison for taxes paid in 25 compared to taxes paid in 26, schools increased the amount of debt an additional $171.8 million. As a result, the property tax rate either stayed flat or increased rather than declining, which could have resulted in higher property tax bills that were coupled with those higher assessed values. As you can also see in the table, conservancy districts, townships, libraries, and special units increased their debt year over year at the highest percentages. Counties and cities and towns decreased their overall reliance on debt, which allowed those rates to decline. Moving on, this slide depicts the total certified levy. So what we're doing is taking those debt levies and we're combining them with rates that depicts the total certified levies, which is determined based off of those local decisions that are being made. Counties as a unit of government saw the lowest change, with conservancy districts and townships seeing the largest percentage increases, with schools showing the highest amount change from 25 to 26. Well, if you put this in mind with that previous slide that showed you what debt was doing, there's certainly a correlation between those debts being issued to this slide here. And finally, on the property tax reform side, this slide shows what those overall net levies do. Remember back to that order of operations where I said line 4 down was a direct dollar for dollar savings to taxpayers, but a proportionate loss to all of those underlying units. This takes that into consideration. So the previous slide was gross levies, where this slide is net levies. It's taking all those gross levies, subtracting out those property tax and circuit breaker credits and reductions. And what you can see from this slide here overall is just each count or each unit of government aggregated across statewide data did show an overall increase, and it varies depending on size and, of course, by individual locality, area, and by municipality and county level data. With that, I'm going to toss it over to Campbell to talk about local income taxes.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm Campbell with AIM. Appreciate you guys having me here. While we were doing all the very, very simple and easy to understand property tax changes in Senate Bill 1, we also had a complete rewrite of the local income tax system. What we have up on the screen right now is the local income tax system as it exists today. Today you have a single local income tax rate county-wide for every county that's adopted by a county adopting body, either your county council or your local income tax council. And the local income taxes are adopted by expenditure category. We have expenditure rates for general government, which we call certified shares, for economic development, for public safety, and then a couple that are specific to county-specific projects like jails, EMS services, the courts, and the county hospitals. We also have property tax relief rates that fund credits on folks' tax bills that are paid for by local income taxes. And actually, in Lake County, the majority of your income taxes in the property tax relief rate that buys down the circuit breaker impact for the local units of government in Lake County. Well, this whole system is being sunset starting in 2029. There will be a new income tax system. So like I said, right now, all of these are done countywide. Those county specific rates are adopted by the county council, and then the rest of them are adopted by the county council or the lake council. And you can see what the totals are right there. Our expenditure rate cap right now is 2.5%. That is being raised to 2.9% in the new system, but rates may still go down because the property tax relief portion of that is being phased out. So right now you'll see that statewide income tax rates vary a lot. Lake County has a relatively low income tax rate, but it gets up into the high 2% in many other localities around the state, with an average around 1.9, and for the expenditure 1.6. And so that's sort of what people are baselining it in when they think about the new system. So the new income tax system is now instead of going to be broken up by expenditure category, it'll be broken up by government type. So county government will have its own income tax rate. Fire and EMS will have its own income tax rate. Non-municipal units, so that's like townships, libraries, all the other special districts, will have its own rate at 0.2. County government has 1.2, fire and EMS has 0.4, and then municipalities also have a cap of 1.2%, but they are unique in that if you have a larger municipality that has a population of 3,500 or more, the city council is allowed to adopt that portion of the rate or choose to opt into the rate for the smaller towns that the county sets. And so there are two options there that will be up to the city council to decide what they want to do with it. You know, in most counties in Indiana, there's only one or maybe two units that can make that decision to opt in or out that are an incorporated municipality above 3,500. But not here in beautiful Lake County, where you have 19 municipalities and 17 of them are above 3,500 in population, which means there may be a lot of differentiation among the rates, depending on where you live in the county. All of the rates that are adopted on the top half of this page are adopted countywide, and everyone in the county pays the same. It's just that municipal rate that changes depending on where you live. But like I said, it might change a lot depending on where you live in Lake County, because you have so many different city councils and town councils that have the authority to adopt that municipal rate. So like I said, the county council adopts all of these rates except for that municipal rate if it's adopted by the city council. And if the city council adopts that municipal rate, it applies only to the incorporated boundaries of the city. That fire and EMS rate has a lot of flexibility as to where they direct that in the county toward which municipalities or township or county services that provide fire and EMS services. So the county council have a lot of discretion there on how to deal with broader conversations about fire protection and EMS. And like I said, all municipalities as of 12/10 last year have the option to be treated to get the countywide rate that's distributed based on their population, or to adopt their own rate. And you know, they don't all have to go together into a single rate, and they don't all have to go separately and do their own rates. You could have some municipalities opting in and some opting out. And like I said, in Lake County, that creates a lot of complexity as to which ones will be paying which rates. You know, from a taxpayer perspective, which what you guys are all experiencing, obviously the local governments are experiencing these property tax impacts, and so that is shaded into a lot of the conversations about what to do with the new local income tax system, and if any of that revenue is going to be made up through local income taxes. So definitely, as your communities start having these conversations about the new local income tax system and what rates they're going to want to adopt, the property tax impacts will be a factor, as well as, of course, the overall taxpayer impacts and what that does to their rate compared to the rates under the old system. So in some ways it's gotten simpler because you just break it up by unit type. You know exactly how much of your local income tax will go to each unit type. In other ways, it's more complicated because now you have rates that are different in different parts of the county. And I do believe that is the last of our slides. So I really appreciate AARP bringing us in for these meetings, and hope that you guys have learned a lot from us and from Dr. DeBoer about all the changes coming to the property tax and income tax system.
Thank you both so much for being here again today, and thank you for being a part of this series with us as we've done this across a lot of the state. We really appreciate both of you for sharing all that information. So thank you again. And lastly, we're going to get to the last portion of this, which now that we have all of this information under our belts, I bet you're wondering what is next for you as a property owner. And as you've heard from our local leaders during this event today, that there are still a lot of unknowns about exactly how Senate Enrolled Act 1 is going to impact you on a local level. So we're going to continue watching how communities take action, as well as monitoring changes that may come from the General Assembly in future legislative sessions. So as you'll see on this slide, in the 2025 General Assembly session, AARP Indiana was successful in working to ensure that our voices were at the table to help older residents stay in their homes as they age, preserving housing affordability and stability. SEA 1 from 2025 contains language that allows counties to establish a program for qualified individuals to defer $100 to $500 of their property tax liability annually, up to a total of around $10,000. The taxes would be paid back with interest when the home is sold or the estate is settled. AARP Indiana supported this deferral program that offers a balanced approach to the challenge of funding vital community services while providing tax relief to those who need it most. To help state leaders better understand how increasing property taxes impacts older homeowners in Indiana, in December of 2024, AARP commissioned a poll of Indiana voters age 50 plus who own a home in the state. The findings showed that after seeing steep increases in property taxes over the past several years, older Hoosiers are increasingly worried about the financial pressure that these taxes are causing and looking towards state leaders to provide them with much needed relief. The data from this survey helps us advocate for meaningful relief that reflects the very real experiences of our members. We surveyed 1,001 registered voters in the state aged 50 and older who live in Indiana and own their primary residence. So here is what we found. The survey revealed that 84% of older homeowners have seen their property taxes increase in the past 3 years. 2/3 of them say that these increases have impacted their household budgets. This is a clear signal that property taxes are becoming a financial strain. Our survey also revealed that support for property tax relief crosses party lines. Whether Republican, Democrat, or Independent, older voters agree that lowering property taxes should be a priority for lawmakers. There is strong support for practical solutions. Nearly 3/4 of respondents support a new statewide tax credit for older homeowners, and even more support the option to pay property taxes monthly, making it easier to manage household budgets. In 2026, lawmakers on the Fiscal Policy Interim Study Committee will hear a report from the Department of Local Government Finance about county and online payment systems that could let taxpayers pay their property taxes monthly. So property taxes do not exist in a vacuum, as we know. Rising costs in areas like home repairs, insurance, transportation, medical expenses all mean that even small increases in property taxes could tip the balance on the scale for older adults. The majority of Hoosiers say future increases would make it hard to afford staying in their homes. So, with all that being said, we have arrived at the conclusion of today's event, and I know that that was an incredible amount of information to cover, but hopefully you found it useful. And if you need to go back and revisit any of the information that we covered today, you can just search for this event on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page. So I want to share a couple of resources that are available to you today that you'll see on your screen, so you can take a picture of this or jot this down. Firstly is the Indiana Department of Local Government and Finance's tax bill estimator that will help you figure out what your taxes might look like. Next is the Indiana Counties Directory that has a lot of additional information that you can go to, which is in.gov/counties. And if you have questions about deductions or relief eligibility, please reach out to your county auditors, as they will be the best point of contact for where you live specifically in Lake County. You can also visit the AARP Foundation website, which you'll see on your screen there. It can be a great resource for you as well. At the start, I mentioned that we would let you know about how you can join AARP Indiana in our efforts on this issue, or really any issue that impacts older Hoosiers and their families. And the first way is to sign up to receive our advocacy alerts. You can scan the QR code on your screen, and it's going to take you where you need to go to sign up to become an AARP activist. Next, you can also sign up to receive text alerts from us by following the directions that you see on your screen. Lastly, you may have seen our team members in their red shirts at various events around Lake County, raising awareness about quality of life issues for those aged 50 and older in the community. We invite you to connect with us at these events and sign up to receive more information about what is going on specifically in Lake County by heading to aarp.org/IN. So that's aarp.org/IN. So thank you again to our guests today and for all of you for joining us, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.